June 4, 1942, over the marshland of Akutan Island, Alaska Territory, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga brought his Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 21-0 down through Aleutian mist with a damaged fighter under him and nowhere forgiving to land. Cold light lay flat on the tundra. The engine note cut across empty ground that looked too soft, too wet, too still for a carrier fighter to trust. He was flying the aircraft the Imperial Japanese Navy had sent across the Pacific as its primary fighter, because it was expected to outfight opponents in turning combat, a machine whose early war reputation already carried a 12-to-1 kill ratio. That confidence was not personal theater. It was built into the whole fighter arm, into the decision to keep pushing lightly protected Zeros forward because the service believed the airplane would win the fight before its own weaknesses mattered. Now Koga kept descending through foul weather toward Akutan, committed to the emergency landing his damage had made unavoidable, with the Zero's legend still intact around him. The confidence was already late. Before Japan understood the danger, the United States would gain the one thing it needed: a flyable Zero that could be studied, tested, and turned into instruction. In 1942, after Koga died on Akutan, and his fighter was found there in July, recovered, repaired, and flown by American test pilots, the aircraft Japan trusted most would begin losing the protection of mystery. That mattered because the Zero had entered the Pacific War not as one fighter among many, but as the central expression of Japanese naval air confidence. Its early combat reputation stood at 12-to-1. At the start of the Pacific War, about 60% of the Imperial Japanese Navy fighter force consisted of A6M Zeros. That is the scale of the wager. Japan had not built a legend around a rare machine. It had armed a huge share of its fighter strength with it. So when Koga crossed the Aleutians on June 4th, he was carrying more than his own life. He was carrying the assumptions of a service that had come to trust a single aircraft as the answer to air combat over water, over distance, and in close maneuvering battle. The Zero was expected to range far, arrive first, and decide the fight on terms favorable to itself. Men flew it believing the machine's agility would solve problems that armor and self-sealing tanks had been sacrificed to avoid. The bargain was harsh, but it had paid in the opening phase of the war, and success hardens doctrine faster than any argument. Akutan made that confidence visible in the strangest possible setting. Not a carrier deck, not a tropical anchorage. Marshland, low cloud, cold sea, and a Japanese naval fighter crossing the edge of American territory. The place itself sharpened the shock. The Zero was supposed to represent reach. Here, it represented reach without safety. A damaged aircraft in Aleutian weather had no margin at all. Koga's emergency descent came out of the Dutch harbor strike, one fragment of a wider Japanese movement in the north. Even there, at the far rim of the war, the Zero still arrived as a feared machine. It had not yet been reduced to a technical object. It was still an active weapon, still associated with surprise, still backed by the institutional conviction that had sent it into combat from the first day of the Pacific struggle. That is why the later American possession of this one airframe would matter beyond salvage. Not because one crash could decide a campaign by itself, because a machine that embodied so much confidence could be made to answer questions it had never been forced to answer in combat. A reputation can survive losses. It does not survive measurement for long. On the Japanese side, there was no reason in that moment to think the Zero's standing had already begun to change. The fighter arm had staked too much on it. The service had too many of them. The war had already taught too many men to trust what the aircraft seemed able to do in the air. Koga's descent looked like damage and bad luck, not the beginning of exposure. His side still treated the Zero as the answer. The number said what that faith was worth: 12-to-1. The aircraft was lying on ground the Japanese would not control in July. While Koga's damaged fighter came lower over Akutan on June 4th, the Japanese operation in the Aleutians was still moving. Orders already given were still being carried out. Aircraft were still returning through weather that made every mile feel longer. In that cold northern light, the war did not pause around one pilot in trouble. It kept its schedule. That is what gives the moment its weight. Koga was not descending inside a dramatic silence. He was descending inside a machine system that still believed in itself. The Zero remained the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary fighter. At the start of the Pacific War, About 60% of its fighter force had been made up of A6M Zeros. Around him stood an entire structure of fuel, carriers, maintenance crews, deck cycles, signals, and doctrine, built on the assumption that this aircraft could meet an opponent and bend the fight its way. The Aleutians stripped all ceremony from that assumption. Mist flattened the horizon. Marsh and water broke the ground into traps. The weather that hid movement also punished damage. A pilot coming down there did not have the clear runway of a land base or the ordered landing circle of a fleet. He had a machine losing options over a surface that looked solid from above and gave no guarantees at all, yet the larger Japanese posture had not changed. The Dutch harbor strike had carried the same confidence north that earlier operations had carried south. The Zero still appeared at the edge of American space as an offensive instrument. It had not become cautious simply because the map had become colder. Its presence over Akutan said the same thing its presence elsewhere had said in the opening war months. This fighter could be sent far into ugly conditions and still be expected to dominate the encounter if combat came. That expectation is the real atmosphere around Koga's approach. Not a speech, not a boast, a service habit. Men trusted the airplane enough to keep using it as the core of their fighter arm, even when the mission stretched over sea and weather with little room for error. Confidence lives most clearly in repeated use. On June 4th, Japan was still repeating the same answer, and beneath Koga, Akutan waited without ceremony. Empty ground. Saturated earth. No audience, no rescue close at hand. The visual shock of it matters, because the Zero's image had been built in motion, in clean attack runs and tight combat turns, not in a wet Aleutian emergency landing. Here the feared aircraft was reduced to touch, balance, weight, and ground. On his side, nothing in the old belief had yet been formally withdrawn. The machine was still trusted. The operation was still underway. The assumption of superiority was still alive enough to fly. The Japanese fighter arm had committed itself to this aircraft. The count behind that commitment was about 60%. What lay in that Aleutian marsh still had not been seen by the men who would change its meaning. The story turns next to the machine before it became evidence. July 1940. China. The legend began when the fighter entered service, not when Koga touched its controls. The Imperial Japanese Navy put the Zero forward as the aircraft meant to carry naval air power across long water, and still arrive ready to fight. It was fast for its class. It carried heavy armament for a carrier fighter. It could range farther than opponents expected from a single-engine machine launched from a deck. In the opening phase of the Pacific War, those facts mattered before the first burst was fired. The aircraft's power was not mystery at first. It was design used in the open. Japanese pilots could choose distance, choose height, then choose the kind of fight they wanted. Against opponents who accepted a turning contest, the Zero tightened the circle and kept tightening. In Malaya, in the Philippines, in the Netherlands, East Indies, the same pattern repeated. The fighter did not need to absorb punishment if it could get to the firing position first. That was the bargain written into the machine. Allied airmen gave it the name they heard most often, the Zero. In the reporting system, it was Zeke. Both names spread because the aircraft itself spread. By early 1942, it had become the face of Japanese naval fighter power from carrier decks and forward fields alike. Its shape was now familiar across the Pacific. Low wing, narrow fuselage, broad canopy, long reach. The machine's reputation rose because it kept appearing where distance should have protected the target. That reputation reached beyond any one pilot's score. Koga mattered because he flew the fighter that carried the confidence of the service. The Imperial Japanese Navy had made the Zero not only a weapon, but a doctrine in metal. Send it far. Let it arrive first. Let it turn inside the enemy. Let skill and maneuver end the fight before protection was tested. In 1942, that logic still held enough force to carry the aircraft north into the Aleutians, far from the warm water campaigns that had built its name. Its method worked because the men around it were trained to serve the same idea. Carrier crews kept it moving through deck cycles. Maintenance teams kept a light machine airworthy under hard operational tempo. Formation discipline delivered fighters where commanders wanted them, at the hour they wanted them. The Zero was not feared because it floated alone in the sky. It was feared because a whole naval system kept placing it over targets at the edge of expectation. By the spring of 1942, The fighter's image had hardened. It was the aircraft an American or British or Dutch pilot expected to meet if the Japanese Navy was present in strength. It was the machine that punished hesitation and rewarded any pilot who could force a close maneuvering fight. That is why the Akutan emergency mattered before anyone knew what had happened there. If a service lets one aircraft stand for superiority, then any exposure of that aircraft reaches far beyond one cockpit. On the Japanese side, there was no reason yet to speak of exposure at all. The Zero still represented range, initiative, and command of the turning fight. Koga was one petty officer inside that larger belief, a pilot of the machine his service still trusted to set the terms of combat over sea and island. A staff officer could have said it plainly that summer. "Keep sending the Zero. It still wins the fight we ask it to fight." The proof was not faith. It was one aircraft type in service from 1940, still defining naval fighter combat in 1942. June 5, 1942. The Aleutians. The old answer still looks sound. Japanese aircraft had reached Dutch Harbor through weather that punished navigation, formation keeping, and recovery. The Zero was still there at the far edge of American territory, not as a relic of earlier victories, but as an active escort and fighter screen. It was operating where cold, cloud, and distance should have reduced any machine's authority. Instead, it remained part of an offensive blow. For the Japanese side, that alone confirmed the aircraft's standing. Nothing in those first hours suggested that the Zero had ceased to impose its preferred conditions. The aircraft still had the same long legs that had carried it across earlier campaigns. It still threatened any opponent willing to get slow and turn with it. It still arrived as part of a naval operation that assumed reach and aggression, not caution. The machine had gone north, and the doctrine had gone with it. That mattered because military belief hardens through repetition. A weapon trusted in one climate can still be doubted in another. The Zero was not. It had now appeared over tropical water, over island chains, and over the cold rim of Alaska territory. Every new map seemed to enlarge its authority. So when Japanese airmen judged the Aleutian missions, they did not see an aircraft nearing the edge of its legend. They saw the same fighter proving itself under yet another set of conditions. The Americans were already present in that judgment, but only as resistance to be handled. The Japanese side could see contact, anti-aircraft fire, interception, and weather losses. What it could not see was any larger consequence in a single missing fighter. One damaged Zero after a raid fit the old arithmetic of war. Air operations lost aircraft. Carriers replaced crews and machines when they could. Operations continued. In the first reading, that was all. So the initial conclusion on the Japanese side was simple. The mission had been flown. The fighter arm had done what it was sent to do. The Zero remained a functioning instrument of offense, even in the Aleutians. Nothing in that reading required a change of doctrine, a withdrawal of confidence, or a new caution about the machine itself. And the Japanese had reason to trust that reading because the aircraft's strengths were visible every time it launched. Range, climb, turning power at lower speed, firepower concentrated forward. Those were not rumors. They were daily experience inside the naval air arm. Men who serviced the fighter, launched it, and flew beside it had no cause in June 1942 to believe that one operation in the north had altered its meaning. What existed instead was a small blind spot. A missing airframe in hostile territory did not yet look like evidence. It looked denied by distance, weather, and isolation. A commander could dismiss the thought in a sentence. If it came down out there, the place itself has finished it for us. That was the comfort, and it rested on one aircraft lost from the immediate Japanese count. July 1942, Akutan Island. Then the numbers failed. A fighter forced down during the Dutch Harbor operation should have been removed from the war by impact, weather, or isolation. Instead, the aircraft remained on Akutan long enough to be found in July. On the Japanese side, 1-0 had been written off as gone. On the American side, 1-0 now existed as a complete problem to be handled. The count on both sides was the same aircraft. The result was not the same. June 1942. Japanese naval air circles. The first reaction was not panic. It was assumption. The aircraft had come down in remote ground under enemy reach and Aleutian conditions. That was enough for men on Koga's side to believe the machine had been destroyed or rendered useless. No special correction followed because none seemed required. In that reading, the North had swallowed one fighter and closed the matter. A senior airman could have ended the discussion with a shrug. We lost the aircraft. We did not lose the secret. The number inside that comfort was 1. July 1942. Akutan Island. The second reaction was not even a reaction at first, because there was nothing Japanese hands could still alter. By the time American search and salvage personnel reached the site in July, the exposure already existed. The aircraft was no longer protected by distance from carrier decks, by the weather that had covered the operation, or by the assumption that a forced landing meant denial. One Japanese airframe had passed beyond Japanese control, without any order, raid, or retrieval effort able to reverse it. That consequence was countable in the simplest way. One fighter gone from the inventory had become one fighter available to the enemy. From the Japanese side, the old picture of the Zero had still not cracked in combat. The machine remained feared, still tied to the opening war victories, still understood through what it did in the air. But Akutan had changed the terms in silence. The aircraft that once defended its reputation by maneuver now sat still enough to be inspected. A machine designed to decide a fight in seconds could now be studied for hours. A Japanese officer could still speak with the old confidence and not yet hear the danger in his own words. It is only one airplane. That was true, and it was the problem. One airplane was all the Americans needed before the next stage began in July. Late summer 1942, San Diego. In American technical control, the Zero stopped being a rumor and became a sequence. Panels came off. Damage was traced. Missing parts were replaced. The enemy lost something at once and for good. Secrecy about the exact behavior of his main carrier fighter. Not its legend, its habits. The machine could now be started, taxied, examined at every angle, and prepared for flight by men outside the Japanese Navy. One captured airframe had become one usable instrument for the other side. September 1942. When the repaired fighter began flying under American hands, the subtraction grew larger. Mission by mission, the enemy lost freedom to let the Zero define the encounter by reputation alone. The findings were concrete enough to teach. At low speed, the aircraft still turned with the old authority. At higher speed, it stiffened. In a dive, it did not own the fight. The instruction that followed was simple and procedural. Do not turn with it. Keep speed. Break away. Come back with discipline instead of pride. The Americans did not need myth anymore. They had repeatable behavior. The first thing that disappeared on the Japanese side was surprise. Before this, a pilot meeting the Zero often met a problem only in the air, at the instant of danger. After the tests, more American pilots arrived already briefed on what to deny it. That did not make the Zero harmless, it made its advantages conditional. The enemy lost the old right to assume that an opponent would accept the circle he offered. One machine on the ground had begun changing many fights in the sky. That autumn, as the war moved through the Solomons, the loss became operational. Japanese naval aviators still flew an aircraft with long range and dangerous low-speed maneuverability, but they no longer met an opponent as unprepared as before. American pilots were being told where the Zero remained lethal and where it could be made to pay. The result was a new kind of resistance. The Japanese side could still press an attack. It could no longer count on awe to hold the other pilot in place. Another loss followed. The Zero had once allowed its pilots to concentrate force where they chose, because fewer enemies were willing or able to fight it on equal terms. Now that room narrowed. American formations that stayed fast and stayed together forced Japanese pilots to work harder for firing position and to spend fuel and altitude for smaller results. The enemy still had the aircraft. He had less space in which to use it as intended. The paperwork stage came next. Once a machine's limits are known, doctrine begins to bend around them whether command likes it or not. Japanese pilots were not fools. If opponents refused the turning fight, then the Zero had to chase a battle it had not been built to control at all speeds. That imposed its own arithmetic, longer pursuits, fewer easy solutions, more exposure while trying to force the old engagement anyway. The confidence signal that had once sat inside the aircraft's design now had to compete with experience. This was not one dramatic reversal. It was accumulation. In one encounter after another, the enemy lost experienced men, under conditions that no longer rewarded the instincts that had first built the fighter's name. Every loss carried more weight because skill in the Japanese naval air arm was harder to replace than an airframe. A pilot brought down after months of combat took training, formation memory, and judgment with him. The Americans were not just learning the airplane. They were making that learning expensive. By the end of 1942, the ring had tightened in a way the Japanese side could measure without any speech about legend. The Zero could still kill, but it could no longer guarantee the shape of the fight, and once that power weakened, the cost of every mission rose. One side was converting test results into routine instruction. The other was spending veteran aviators to defend an aircraft that had stopped being unknowable. We cannot fight carelessly against them now. That was the enemy's position, whether spoken plainly or not. One recovered fighter had become many American briefings, and one briefed force was enough to begin stripping away the margin the Zero had carried into combat. Autumn 1942. The answer to the anomaly was not the captured airplane by itself. It was the system waiting for it. That was why the result could be repeated. The Zero had not been exposed to one clever pilot in one exceptional duel. It had been fed into an American process built to turn measurement into habit. Test flights produced behavior. Behavior became guidance. Guidance moved through training and briefings to units that had never seen Akutan. That is why the same adjustment could appear again in a different sky, against a different Japanese pilot, and still work. The mystery had been converted into doctrine. The enemy could see the effect before he could stop it. Opponents who once entered the Zero's preferred fight began refusing it with greater consistency. They kept formation discipline. They used speed to separate. They attacked in passes instead of circling into the old trap. The Japanese side was not facing a single new trick. It was facing an enemy that had learned to behave the same way on purpose. The airframe had given the Americans something more dangerous than information. It had given them a standard. That standard exposed the limit in every Japanese adjustment. If a commander tried to preserve the Zero's advantage by pushing pilots toward tighter maneuvering combat, he needed an opponent willing to stay there. More and more often, that opponent did not. If he tried to force contact through aggression, the Zero had to spend fuel and position chasing a fight that kept slipping into higher speed passes. If he spread his fighters to protect more space, he diluted the concentration that had once helped the aircraft dominate locally. Each answer consumed something. None restored control. The machine behind the pressure was training, but not training alone. It was the larger American capacity to keep issuing the same lesson to fresh crews, new squadrons, and replacements. That was the door script 2 left open. Why did the pattern not close after one success? Because the Americans did not need the Akutan Zero to surprise the enemy once. They needed it to teach the same refusal over and over. The enemy's countermeasure had to beat a process, not a pilot. By late 1942, the Japanese side was adapting under shrinking margin. The Zero still had uses. It still escorted, intercepted, and attacked. But now every deployment carried a quieter question inside it. Could the aircraft still force its own geometry before the Americans used the briefing against it? The answer was no longer automatic. That changed behavior. Pilots had to take greater risks to recover an older advantage. Commanders had fewer grounds to believe that the old result would return simply by ordering more of the same. The cost of that realization was institutional. Japanese naval aviation had built much of its early confidence around a fighter that rewarded elite training and punished hesitation in the enemy. Once the enemy learned which invitations to refuse, the institution had to ask more from the same shrinking pool of skilled pilots. Better execution, tighter timing, more nerve. The aircraft had not become weak. It had become conditional, and a conditional weapon is harder to build doctrine around. That is why the Akutan tests matter most as a force multiplier inside a larger American shift. New tactics and better equipment were already changing the fight. The tests gave those changes a cleaner center. They told American pilots not merely that the Zero could be beaten, but how not to feed it the combat it wanted. For the Japanese side, that meant every adjustment started late. It was now reacting to enemy behavior built from controlled knowledge. By the end of that year, the Japanese command still possessed the fighter that had once carried offensive certainty across the Pacific. What it lacked was any reliable way to restore the old aura around it. The Zero was being sent back into battle as a weapon whose limits had been circulated among the men meant to face it. They know us now. That was the enemy's dilemma. One captured aircraft had become a repeatable lesson, and repeatable lessons do not stay in one squadron. Late 1942. Pacific combat. The final approach to the fall did not look dramatic at first. It looked procedural. American pilots entered combat with fewer illusions about the Zero. Japanese pilots entered it with less certainty that the old invitation would be accepted. The first break in the institution came there, inside cockpit behavior. The Zero still offered its low-speed turn. More opponents refused. The Japanese side still tried to bend combat back toward the familiar circle. More often it had to fight for the chance. For the men inside the Imperial Japanese Navy fighter arm, that meant losing something more serious than prestige. They lost confidence in repeatability. An aircraft could still perform as designed, and still fail to produce the old result if the enemy had learned the answer. That is the kind of crisis that does not begin with shouting. It begins when the same machine, flown with skill, yields thinner returns mission after mission. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga did not live to see that break. He died on Akutan in June 1942 in the crash landing that followed the Dutch harbor operation. His A6M2 passed into American hands, was recovered in July, repaired, and flown in September. The Japanese side lost the pilot once. It lost the aircraft twice, first from its own inventory, then from its own control over what the machine could teach the enemy. From there, the collapse was not of metal alone. It was of belief. The Zero had entered the war carrying an early combat kill ratio of 12-1. It had been the main weight of the Imperial Japanese Navy fighter force, about 60% at the start of the Pacific War. Those numbers had supported a habit of thought. The fighter would arrive, turn tighter, and punish whoever answered it on those terms. After the Akutan tests were absorbed into American training, that habit no longer held by itself. The Americans present in this reversal did not need to be legends. Search and salvage personnel on Akutan delivered the aircraft into technical control. American test pilots flew the repaired fighter and translated what it did into usable limits. Fleet and training commands circulated the result.